Greetings everyone, Pete Pardo here from Sea Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of Questions and Answers. Today is Saturday, September the 21st, as we're kind of steamrolling through September. October's right around the corner. Today we've got probably a few more questions that I normally answer. I picked some really good ones. We had some really good questions for this week, so I'm going to try and get to as many as I possibly can. So let's jump right in. Our first question is from Thomas Sharpless. Thomas says, as always, you're the man. Thank you, Thomas. It never ceases to amaze me just how many of your life experiences have mirrored mine. The order in which you purchased Scorpions albums is exactly the same as mine, except that I got Virgin Killer just ahead of getting Animal Magnetism. Blackout, then Love Drive, then Virgin Killer for me. Boy, was I shocked when I put Virgin Killer on for the first time and was expecting it to sound like Blackout. Nothing like it, right? Anyway, on to my question today. You recently had your friend Chris on for the classic album War Rainbow on Stage versus Tokyo Tapes. I thought it was interesting that he preferred live albums that didn't have songs that were extended super jams. I have to agree with him to a point. There's a fine line between the creative improv being fantastic and it being excessively boring. And let me, before I get on to Thomas's question, let me just clarify Chris's statements on that show. Chris actually loves the Ronnie James Dio era of Rainbow, or should I say the Rising era, or Rising Band. The reason why he doesn't listen to Rainbow on Stage much is because other than a few, killer, Kill the King and Man on a Silver Mountain and maybe one or two other tracks which are awesome on there, a lot of the other tunes are just really long and there's a lot of extended jamming. So it's not that he doesn't like that version of Rainbow, he loves it, but he just prefers in live albums that there's less of the improv going on, okay, which is the reason why he likes Tokyo Tapes a lot better. So anyway, on to your question. What bands do you think walk this line the best? In other words, create better renditions of their live numbers that are more creative than the studio and yet that do not go overboard with tedious overplay of their classic material. Well, I for one love listening to Frank Marino live recordings, because I think Frank, although for some people Frank may go way over the top with the improvisations, I think Frank takes very strong studio material and just injects this feeling of I don't even know how to describe it. It just takes the songs to another level by adding even more superhuman guitar work in there and solos and improvisations. And again, I know for some people that may be a little too much. I just think Frank I prefer his live renditions to most of his studio stuff. Even though I love his studio material, we got this crazy bee flying around here. For me, Deep Purple, I think, is another band. There may be some people who don't like the early years, like the Made in Japan stuff, but I think if you listen to any of the Mark II or Mark III, especially live recordings, they take a lot of those great studio tracks and they just amp them up a bit. They add, some extra solos. They extend some of the passages. I always like that. They still do that to this day. Dream Theater's another band who, for me, I think takes excellent studio material, and live they add that little element of danger. They add a little bit here and there, but they still recreate those impossible studio parts live. Yes, also, maybe not so much anymore, but I think Yes back in the day really took those studio songs and made them extra special on stage. I think you could throw Hendrix in there as well. Certainly The Who also. The Who, most of those Who live recordings from early 70s, can't beat that stuff, right? I mean, they just, look at what they did to the Tommy album, which is great on its own, but man, Tommy live on stage became a whole other beast, right? Good question. Thanks, Thomas. From Russell Gentile. Hey, Pete, I got a late one for you. How did your family react to your musical taste, especially heavy metal and listening to thrash and death metal? Being Italian and raised Catholic like you, I think my parents were probably wondering what kind of music I was listening to in the early 80s. Give us your story. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of touched on this before, and I think one of these days my plan is to try and convince my mom to come on the show so she can talk a little bit more about her perception of this. But, I started getting into, Black Sabbath and Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and Purple, Zeppelin and the Scorpions, and I was already into Kiss, and my parents were like, oh, Jesus, this is like a far cry from the Eagles and Paul McCartney Wings and ELO and, Meatloaf and that sort of thing. And it just, it became a part of my life, and they just accepted it. They didn't really like it, but they accepted it. I think I probably disturbed them more with Kiss than anything else. And then I think, the name Black Sabbath and, the imagery of Black Sabbath early on was kind of a little strange for them. But they dealt with it. Honestly, when I started listening to like extreme metal, like death and black metal and all that kind of stuff, you know, especially Slayer and Metallica and Celtic Frost and Venom and all that stuff, like in the mid '80s. I mean, I was already away at college, so you know, other than my hair growing, getting long, and wearing funky earrings and strange concert T-shirts, they really weren't hearing the music because I was already out of the house. But yeah, it's like, you know, as for Catholic parents, you know, our son is listening to some kind of questionable bands there, right? So, but I'll let my mother hopefully tell that herself one of these days. From NP, I know you said before that you're not a fan of Entomb, but what about Black Mark Records? They were the home of Edge of Sanity and bands like Bathory and Quorthon. A lot of people say metal was dead in the early 90s, but to me, labels like Earache and Black Mark were keeping metal alive, at least in Europe. Got the dogs playing outside. It seems to me that bands like Opeth and Catatonia get a lot of buzz about being metal in the 90s, but Sweden and labels like Earache and Black Mark don't get enough credit for promoting metal in the 90s. Dan Swano is an artist and producer, is a one-man metal machine, for example. Just wondering what your thoughts about the importance of this era of metal, as it's the one I grew up with. While I will always love bands like Metallica, Slayer, Iron Maiden, etc., I love the early mid-90s era of European metal just as much. I mean, yeah, and you know, and I'll be the first to tell you, I wasn't listening to a ton of metal in the 90s. I kind of, you know, grunge came and just kind of killed it all for me, and I got heavily into prog and, you know, more like classic stuff, you know, classic hard rock and metal, and I really wasn't listening to a lot of new metal in that decade. And I didn't start to get into it till probably like 98, 99, all right, and into the 2000s. By then, of course, I was discovering all the Black Mark record stuff, and you know, Edge of Sanity was one of those bands because I first started getting into Opeth and the Dan Swano related stuff, and of course, you know, Edge of Sanity for me were kind of like a little bit different. They were death metal, but they were pretty progressive and stuff, and I love the production value of a lot of those albums. So yeah, I mean, Earache Records, you know, and Black Mark Records was releasing a ton of stuff on the underground, and I think that's how, you know, metal was really thriving, especially extreme metal was really thriving in the European underground for that entire decade. And it wasn't until I think the late in the 90s and certainly to the 2000s where everybody started, you know, extreme metal all of a sudden was like the thing to jump on, and that's when we started saying, oh, there's been all these great bands that released cool albums in the 90s on these like smaller record labels. So yeah, an important time, absolutely, and an important couple of labels there that really kept things going, I think, for much of that decade. From Larry Wawa, what was the oddest or mismatched opening act to a headliner you have ever seen or heard about in concert? Well, I'm going to go by the ones that I've seen. I thought the poor Johnny Van Zant band didn't stand a chance opening up for Black Sabbath on the Mob Rules tour. Granted, I thought they were pretty good, but that was just like, why do that to Johnny Van Zant band? I mean, they literally got booed off the stage after like 20 minutes, and I felt really bad for them because, like I said, they put on a good performance, but man, Sabbath fans are tough, and throwing a Southern rock act up there with the Masters, not a good choice. Also, you know, looking back on it, it's pretty cool, but I think back in the day, I thought Rory Gallagher was a bizarre opening choice for Rush. You know, like a blues rock guitar player opening up for Rush didn't make much sense to me, and back in the day, I really wasn't all that hip to Rory Gallagher and what he was all about. You know, hindsight is 20/20. If I were to go back in a time machine, I'm sure I'd be like, oh my God, I'm seeing Rory Gallagher, right? But yeah, that was kind of bizarre too as well. I'm sure there's more if I could probably sit and think about it for a while. From the Inspired Amateurs, hey Pete, what is your top 5 Todd Rundgren solo albums? Well, Wizard of True Star, Todd, Something Anything, Initiation, and Hermit and Mink Hollow. Those are my favorites. I like all of them, especially the early ones, but man, can't beat those. From Amanda Morgan, hi Pete, who is your favorite Deep Purple lead singer? Mine is David Coverdale, and why? Thank you, from Marty Morgan, Hamilton, New Zealand. P.S. Really love your work. Rock on. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Well, I think if you've been watching the show, you know my favorite Deep Purple singer is Ian Gillan. However, Mr. Coverdale is really close behind. Really close behind. In fact, my 3 favorite singers of all time are Ian Gillan, Ronnie James Dio, and David Coverdale. Love them all to death, big time. And I have probably told many people that I have long had a secret man crush on David Coverdale, just because I think that, and again, I always like Gillan's my guy. I just love the Gillan swagger and power from the 70s and most of the 80s was just untouchable. And I appreciate his elder statesman approach to singing these days, right? But just Coverdale to me always had the kind of the swagger, and Coverdale was always just a rock star. All right, I just always loved everything about Coverdale, and you know, and I of course love the bands he's been in, right? You know, Purple and Whitesnake, man, two of my favorite bands. So there you go. From Alexandre Serafini, I love that name, Alexandre Serafini. You must be Italian, right? Hey Pete, I have a question. Don't know if you already talked about this, but why Caress of Steel by Rush is it such an underrated album? Well, I think that Caress of Steel, out of all the Rush albums, is really like not that accessible to normal listeners. I think hardcore Rush fans love that album for what it is. It's heavy, it's progressive, it's dark. There's really nothing, you know, there's not a lot of hooks on that album. There's just, you know, even like Fly By Night, which came before it, had some good hooks on it. Pretty approachable, you know, a good half of that album is pretty approachable and accessible. Caress of Steel, not so much, but that's what I love about it. I think there's some seriously creative stuff on that album, and heavy stuff on that album. That's why for me, Caress of Steel, I think, is one of the hidden gems in that early Rush catalog. Just a great album. Just, you know, the birth of progressive metal. It's filtering all throughout that album, man. I'm telling you, great stuff. I dig it. I dig it. But sometimes I talk to people who are like, you know, casual Rush fans and really just like, you know, the 80s stuff, you know, Moving Pictures and all the stuff there. Maybe a little bit of Permanent Waves and what have you. You know, I bring up Caress of Steel and they're like, ugh, that's... And I'm like, really? From Kenneth Sanchez. Hi, Pete. I'm a Deep Purple fan. About their induction in the 2016 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Do you agree that Steve Morse, Don Airey, Tommy Bolin, Nick Simper, etc. were not inducted? Other bands have most members being inducted. I absolutely don't agree with it. First of all, if you're going to induct Rod Evans from the Mark I album and everybody else in that lineup, why the fuck are you not inducting Nick Simper? He was one of the original members. If you're going to induct that whole band, you got to induct the guy. The fact that he got excluded is just mind-boggling. And you know what? If you're going to induct the band, and you know what? It's not like they've had a million lineup changes. They really haven't. So really, you're talking about, like you said, you're talking about Steve Morse, Don Airey, Tommy Bolin, throw Joe Lynn Turner in there, and you got everybody. So why not just induct them all? Because quite frankly, Morse and Airey have been in the band for a long time. All right, I don't understand it. I think it's a slight, and they should never have done that. You either induct everybody or just don't do it. You know, Simper has got to be in there. If they're going to put Evans in there, you got to put Simper. And quite frankly, you can't just induct the other three guys. I mean, come on. So yeah, I don't agree with it. I think they got slighted there. They should have been included. From Tate Davis. If you're okay with me asking a question regarding the Royal Affair show you caught at Bethel Woods, how would you rank each performing ensemble's presentation of the music from their respective catalogs, with 4 being the weakest and 1 being the best? I have a feeling that Yes will be at number 4, and I'm curious about the other 3. Great video as always. Your channel keeps getting better and better. P.S. I played Pot Liquor's version of You're No Good on my college radio station today, thanks to your History of Southern Rock show. That's great, isn't it? I listened to that album the other day at the gym, and I was like, oh man, they do a cranking version of You're No Good. All right, so the Royal Affair show, which I saw earlier this summer, let's see, 1 to 4, 4 being the weakest. All right, let's start off with Carl Palmer's ELP. Or let's see, I would say, or ELP Legacy. Carl Palmer's ELP Legacy, I think that's what they were called. That was a lot of fun. I would say that was a solid 3. No, sorry, 1 being the best. That's solid 2. You know, Arthur Brown's vocals are not, although it's cool to see him up there, his vocals are not that good anymore. And I think the set was just too short. But instrumentally, it was a lot of fun, and I've seen them do that. I've seen Carl and company do that before, so that was a lot of fun. Then we got the whole Moody Blues thing. That was good too. I don't know. 2.5, 3, something like that. All right, 2 and 2, 2.5. Okay, that was good. That was solid. Asia, I enjoyed. I thought Asia 3, 3.5. No, I'm sorry, 2. between a 1 and 2. I don't know. I mean, that was fun. I think I enjoyed Asia the most. I would say, oh, are you looking at me to rank them? Okay, gotcha. We're not doing each one of them. Okay, so I think that my favorite was Asia. I think that I enjoyed, yes, I did. I mean, I made some critiques of their show, but I actually enjoyed them. So I would say Asia being 2. I would say Carl Palmer being 3, and I would say probably the John Lodge Moody Blues thing probably being 4. And it wasn't weak. I mean, none of them. They were all fun. They were all fun. You know what? Maybe I'd put Carl Palmer ahead of Yes. Carl Palmer that was a lot of fun. You know, yeah, let's go Asia 1, Carl Palmer 2, Yes 3, and John Lodge number 4. But again, I enjoyed John Lodge 2. I'm just not as big a Moody's fan as some of the other acts there. But and you know, I had some critiques of the Yes show, but other than that, it was okay. Not one of my favorite Yes performances, but it was okay. From Mark Williams, hey Pete, another great show. Where do you think the Tubes will leave their mark on rock history? Very underrated in my opinion. I also feel Fee Waybill is one of the most underrated singers ever. I mean, I dig the Tubes. You know, as far as leaving their mark on rock history, I think that they kind of combine like quirkiness and theatrical stuff like very few other bands have done. And I think their music is, you know, it's pretty challenging. Some of their stuff is kind of poppy, but for the most part, like their early catalog, you know, pretty challenging music. They have this flair to their stuff that I always really liked. I kind of sometimes I lump them, you know, like Max Webster from Canada, very similar, like Thinking Man's rock and roll. And I think, you know, to a lot of the masses, those bands kind of get lost a little bit. But I think to people who really appreciate different styles of music, I think that a band like the Tubes will forever be listened to and thought and talked about. So, you know, where they leave their mark ultimately, I don't really know. You know, they were never a mega band, but they're still out there slogging around today. I still love throwing Tubes albums on every so often, and a really fun band, I think. From One Ring DHS, Pete, when you have bands that you were once a great fan of but have lost you with their catalog in later years, are you a rigid completist that keeps buying their releases, or do you bail on them at a certain point? God. I mean, if they've completely lost me, I will bail at some point. Very rare that that's happened, though. Usually, most bands kind of keep somewhat of a, you know, I'll give you a perfect example, like Genesis. I was a big fan of Genesis early on. I will readily admit that with the start of the 80s, they kind of lost me. And I would not listen to any 80s Genesis stuff until like the last year. I decided to go back and revisit those 80s albums from Genesis, and I took a liking to them. And so I, you know, kind of changed my tune. But there are times where, you know, a band... Jesus, alrighty then. The wonders of recording outside in the early fall. Late summer, early fall. Stink bugs, bees, they're all over the place. Yeah, so it depends how bad they go off the rails. That's what I'm saying. So, yeah, if it's big time off the rail, case in point, although their last album wasn't too bad, you know, Morbid Angel, you know, death metal, classic death metal act, God, they released an absolute stinker of an album a couple years back. And I was like, ugh, if this is how they're going to continue, man, I am done with them. But I'm always, you know, sometimes classic bands release like a crappy album. I'll keep giving them a chance till they prove to me that they're absolutely done. But sometimes they'll release a crappy album, and then they'll be like, you know, they'll hear the bad press and, you know, the stuff from the fans, and then they'll be like, all right, we better get back to doing what we do best, right? So I'll keep following. But if, you know, you kind of fail me 2 albums in a row, I may be like, you know what, done. Another perfect example, In Flames, okay? Swedish melodic death metal band who I like quite a bit early in their career, man. They started putting out these horrible metalcore albums that are clearly, you know, directed towards young, you know, metal fans here in the U.S., and man, they lost me. I'm done with them. So yeah, I've completely walked away from the In Flames stuff. It's like, because they've now released, I think, what, 4 or 5 albums in a row that, ugh, terrible. From Brian, new sir, hey Pete, loving lots of the shows and also appreciate the fact that you seem like an intelligent, well-versed, normal, everyday sort of guy and not a name dropper or a burned-out stoner like some other online music-related show host. Refreshing indeed. Yeah, thanks. I'm just, I'm like you guys. I'm just a fan. I'm just a music fan who's been kind of following for so long and doing this thing I've been doing for, 20 years, and I just dig it. I love it. It's a passion of mine. Brian says, I'm 57 years old, and I believe that you might have mentioned at some point that you yourself are also in your early to mid-50s. Yeah, I'll be 54 in a couple months. So my music question is also an age-related one as well. It's also a two-parter. One, do you find that as you grow older, you set limits on the amount that you're willing to spend on concert tickets depending on the performer? Yeah. Because as you know, tickets get more and more expensive, and especially if you want to go to a big venue, it's just, you're going to be spending $100, $150, whatever, to see a classic artist. And I just, you add up going travel and all that kind of stuff, you're talking $2 bills plus. So yeah, I prefer going to local stuff now, and it's usually a lot cheaper and it's less to drive, and that kind of moves into your second part of your question. Do you find that as you grow older you are less willing to travel a farther distance to attend concerts depending on the performer? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have a hard time driving at night. I have a hard time driving and staying awake at night, like late at night. So if I got to drive, an hour plus to a show and coming home, I'm not looking forward to that. All right, same thing with riding trains. Like I live 65 miles from New York City. I could drive. It's easier to drive because you don't have to worry about train schedules and all that crap. You go, you drive, you park, you get out of the show, you get your car, and you get the hell out, right? And that's great because you're home in an hour and 15 minutes. But then if it's late at night, I have an issue staying awake behind the wheel. So that's a problem. The trains are another nightmare because, again, there's not a lot of trains leaving from up here where I live. I live up in the sticks, and sometimes I got to leave shows a little early, or I have to wait till 2 hours after the concert's done to catch my train, and by then I'm exhausted. So yeah, I tend to, if it's less than an hour from me, I would rather go there than travel an hour and a half, 2 hours somewhere else, just because I can't do it anymore. I'm getting older, man. It's just like, can't do it. And now it's like I've seen everybody I've ever wanted to see, and so if I find what I'm doing is I'm going to seeing these same bands over and over and over again, and I'd rather just go to see the bands that really mean a lot to me, maybe once a year. This year I got kind of turned off by a bunch of things going on at concerts, and I'm thinking going into next year, I'm going to limit the amount of shows I go to even more. In saying that, I'm going to see King Crimson tonight at Radio City Music Hall. From Arnaud B. We all know that globally speaking, rock critics don't like progressive rock with the exception of two bands, King Crimson and Van der Graaf Generator. Why the exception for these two bands in particular? Well, I don't know, honestly. I mean, how many rock critics are you talking about, Arnaud? Because I've read lots of stuff about King Crimson that hasn't been as, complimentary. I think they get a lot of decent press because of their legacy. As far as Van der Graaf Generator, I mean, they're still a pretty underground band. I honestly don't know how many critics even, mainstream critics even know who Van der Graaf is. But King Crimson, it's a legacy thing. I just read actually yesterday, thanks to Jeff Young who forwarded me the interview, an interview in Rolling Stone, I guess Rolling Stone Magazine or Rolling Stone Online, probably the best article/interview I've ever read from Rolling Stone. A huge, lengthy talk with Robert Fripp about the King Crimson legacy and all that kind of stuff, and really well written. I just think that there's kind of like this grandfatherly thing about King Crimson that critics have softened up on over the years. From Vincent Guarna. Pete, you mentioned that there are several CDs you are still searching for and cannot find because they are out of print. It would be interesting to hear your list to those hard-to-find CDs. I have many of my own hard-to-find list and would like to compare. There's probably a bunch of like jazzy things that I still have yet to track down, but I didn't kind of go out and find those, do the research on those ones, but a couple did come to mind right off the bat. I would love to get my hands on those those only two Piper albums on CD. The self-titled and Can't Wait. I mean, I think those were on a 2-on-1 a million years ago, and they're long out of print, and those are great, but I haven't been able to track them down. Another one fairly recently, well, I've actually been looking for it for about a year, but there was a prog band from the early mid-70s called Ross, R-O-S-S. They released the self-titled one in '74 and The Pit and the Pendulum a year later. Those are really good. I've listened to those, and they're really good, but they're long out of print, too. You can't find them for anything less than, like, $75, $100 or more. So those are the two that come to mind first. But, yeah, there are some probably make a good show, standalone show. There are some kind of jazz and jazz fusion things that are still not, that are out of print that I would like to track down. From Johnny Perro. Sometimes you talk about the days when we were young and were totally into heavy metal. Now I like your opinion about the genre that came for a short time just between the new wave of British heavy metal and the thrash invasion, namely speed metal. Bands like Anvil and Exciter were one of the most popular in the genre and very influential in what became thrash. Can you tell me some other bands in this genre worth listening to? Well, I think first of all you got to kind of listen to Motorhead, because they were kind of like one of the first bands that were doing that thing. Venom also, Venom certainly. That early Accept stuff, those first couple of Accept albums. Anvil you mentioned, Exciter you mentioned, Agent Steel, okay? Definitely those early Halloween recordings, man. Walls of Jericho is complete speed metal, all right? Gravedigger, early Gravedigger, Liege Lord, Rage, Raven. How about that New York band Toxic? Definitely check out Toxic. That early Metal Church, the first like 2 albums. There's a lot of good early speed metal on there, and Razor. So a lot of good bands popping up around that time, kind of like, yeah, helping to bridge the gap to full-on thrash. From Colston Veer, it always interests me when you talk about U.S. radio. Coming from the UK prior to the digital age, we were very limited in access to classic rock, prog, or metal on the radio. In fact, there was one show lasting 2 to 3 hours a week, the Friday Rock Show with Tommy Vance. TV on the radio, TV on the radio, Thomas the Vance. He played a mixture of new wave of British heavy metal, classic rock, prog, and the occasional dash of jazz fusion. I first heard Herbie Hancock and Frank Zappa on this show. The theme tune was Dixie Dregg's Take It Off the Top. Off of What If, yeah. That was actually also the theme song to a wrestling program I used to watch every Saturday morning on Channel 5 or something like that back in like the late 70s or early 80s. Crazy. There was an annual birthday show which played a fan-voted top 10 or so. This normally included Supper's Ready, Grendel, Child in Time, Stargazer, Stairway to Heaven, 2112, Whole Lotta Rosie, Awaken, and Freeburg. I really like to hear, jealously, your experience of U.S. radio in the 70s and the 80s. Well, let me tell you something. They never played stuff like that. No, I mean, growing up there was only one local FM rock station here, and then there was one from New York City I listened to also. And they played a lot of good deep album cuts by all the classic bands. But more importantly, they would play, if a new album came out, Tala, Jesus, they would play songs from a new album release from a major band. And, the record labels would say, obviously, feature these couple of tunes, right? But feel free to play whatever you want. So you would hear, cool stuff. Like, I still remember, hearing 3 or 4 tunes from that Adventures in Utopia album by Utopia. I remember hearing the Tubes all the time. I remember hearing Donnie Iris. I remember hearing Frank Marino and Ted Nugent and, all sorts of crazy stuff. That, now forget it. They never play. So, I don't know. Based on a lot of the stuff you're mentioning here, we never got to hear stuff that good. At least not where I live. But we heard some cool things. We heard some cool stuff. From Amadeo Eichberg, 1-2 Punch. Boxing analogy works to describe when 2 ridiculously great tracks open up an album. Iron Maiden, Aces High, 2 Minutes to Midnight, Rush, Tom Sawyer, Red Barchetta, and Ozzy, Over the Mountain and Flying High Again make my list. Pete, in your opinion, what are among the best hard rock album 1-2 punches? Man, I could do a whole show on that. Fuck. Wow. All right, just some stuff that I jotted down here. The Mighty Black Sabbath, man. How about Neon Nights and Children of the Sea from Heaven and Hell? How about Sweet Leaf and After Forever from Master of Reality? How about Sabbath Bloody Sabbath and a National Acrobat from Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, all right? How about Dio, Stand Up and Shout and Holy Diver from the Holy Diver album? Deep Purple, Speed King and Bloodsucker from In Rock. UFO, Only You Can Rock Me and Pack It Up and Go from The Session. Opeth, Ghost of Perdition and the Baying of the Hounds. Killer. 1-2 tracks right there. Man, each one 10 minutes long. Man, I could do a whole show on that. If you guys are interested in hearing a whole show on some of my favorite 1-2 punches, put your comments in here and let me know. Maybe I'd do that on a live broadcast sometime over the next couple weeks. From Matty Boy Walker, hey Pete, like yourself, I'm a massive Thin Lizzy fan. My question is, all the lineups, who is the best twin guitar partnership? I know everyone loves Brian Robertson alongside Scott Gorham, but personally I think Gary Moore is a better player. Your thoughts? Well, unquestionably Gary Moore is a better player than any of the guys, all right, in my opinion. But, when it comes down to it, the classic Thin Lizzy material was done by Brian Robertson and Gorham. So that is my favorite guitar team. My favorite guitar player is Gary Moore. I also love John Sykes to death as well. So, you know, we know who the talented, the ultra-talented guys are in that band, but I think the guys that just worked spectacularly together was Robertson and Gorham. Just my opinion, of course. From Jeff Audrain, Pete, beyond Kansas and Starcastle, who are your favorite 10 American prog bands, and how do you think they stack up against the English, German, and Japanese prog outfits? Well, let's go Happy the Man, Cathedral, and no, not the doom metal band Cathedral, the American band Cathedral, Yezda Urfa, Echelon, Spock's Beer, Glasshammer, Transatlantic. Let's throw Dream Theater in there. Dixie Dregs, why not? They kind of bridge the gap between prog and fusion and what have you. Presto Ballet, Mirthrander, 70s band. You know, how they stack up, I mean, I think still the best bands came from, were the British bands. Okay? You know, you got some great German ones too. But, you know, you got some bands there, you know, Starcastle and Kansas, love them to death. So I think we had some really good U.S. prog bands. Unfortunately, they get kind of overshadowed by the British ones, which that's the cream of the crop right there, right? But I think that the American ones stack up pretty well with Germany and Japan, in my opinion. From Richard Bone, hey Pete, question maybe for another Q&A. Not sure if it's been touched before, but what's your opinion of the so-called AOR genre of melodic rock acts like Survivor, Richard Marx, Loverboy, Strange Ways, Michael Bolton, Jafria, Rick Springfield, The Outfield, Honeymoon Suite, Mr. Bryan Adams, White Sister, Toto, etc. The sort of lighter, more radio-friendly mainstream pop rock. Sometimes bands like Journey, REO Speedwagon, 38 Special, Night Ranger, and Foreigner are lumped in there too because of hit singles. Yeah, I mean, I like all that stuff for the most part. You know, I dig like early Loverboy stuff. Richard Marx, I like a couple tunes. I like some of the early Survivor stuff. I'm not familiar with Strange Ways. I love the Jafria stuff. Michael Bolton, The Outfield, Honeymoon Suite, Mr. That's okay. Bryan Adams, I like some of the Bryan Adams stuff. White Sister, I'm not familiar with. I love Toto. I was just listening to Toto yesterday, as a matter of fact. And REO Journey, 38 Special, Night Ranger. I like Foreigner, love all that stuff. So I'm big into it. Yeah, a lot of hit singles, but you know what? A lot of really good albums. Most of those bands had a lot of really good albums, and a lot of those bands rocked quite a bit as well. From Rick Labonte, just for the record, I use your playlist and I never miss anything. Well, good, you should. You have organized it well. Maybe that is how I am labeled as a top fan on Facebook. Could be. Keep up the good work. I do have a question for you. Knowing that you are a Uriah Heep fan, do you collect all the solo work of present and past members? I know you have covered David Byron and his Rough Diamond Project and Ken Hensley Guns for Hired albums such Blackfoot, Siagma, Vertical Smile, Head Machine, Weed, Tofat, etc. Do you have Phil Lanzon's 2 solo releases? By the way, they are fantastic. Bernie Shaw is releasing an album this year. Does that interest you to collect their work besides what they do for Uriah Heep? I have a bunch of Ken Hensley solo stuff, along with his more recent band that he's put together. Yeah, I have the Weed, Tofat, Head Machine. I got all that stuff. I got a bunch of like related Heap stuff from the 70s. I don't have. I've heard Phil's newest solo album is very, very good. I don't have it yet, and I haven't heard any of Phil's solo stuff or Bernie's solo stuff. But I do have various, you know, solo things from some of the past members. So yeah, I love all Heap stuff, obviously. From Jamie Laszlo, I was unable to find where you might have touched on this before, but you still may have. Anyway, I recently came across the song Bombay Calling by It's a Beautiful Day. My first question is simply, what the hell is up with that? My more serious second question is, does it bother you in the slightest that Deep Purple's Child in Time was lifted from this song? I mean, yeah, that's a pretty funny thing. But, you know, at the time, the guys in Purple were big into It's a Beautiful Day, and yeah, they took like the main kind of musical theme of that song and created Child in Time. I mean, you know, so you can see that stuff was happening even way back then. Does it bother me? Not really. Honestly, I never heard Bombay Calling till a couple years ago, so I've always been, you know, into Child in Time. So yeah, kind of weird, but they admitted it. It's not like they said, hey, you know, they tried to hide it or anything like that. So as long as they did that. From Scalagrimma Kvolfelsson, hey Pete, thank you very much for answering my last question. It's always good to hear your expert opinion. My question this week is related to the live album wars. Is there any Genesis song you prefer in a live album version over the studio? And if so, for what reason? All right, let's go to Seconds Out first. I really love Squonk off Seconds Out. I just think it's got a little more fire than the studio version. And plus, that's the first Genesis song I ever heard. Okay? Because my first Genesis album I ever bought was Seconds Out, and I remember totally being into Squonk. Watcher of the Skies off of The live album, oh man, the studio version is great too, but I just, there's a menacing nature to the live version, which I dig. Dance on a Volcano and Los Endos from Seconds Out, in my opinion, way better than the studio version, and because of the drumming. I just think the drumming is off the charts. Back to the live album, I think that the musical box, I think, is pretty damn potent on that live album. Return of the Giant Hogweed, I think, is a little heavier. It's got a little more drive to it than the studio version. And The Knife arguably could be better also on that album as well. I just think that that live album is a powerhouse. I mean, Genesis just bursting with energy in that performance from that album. From Milford123, hey Pete, sorry if this has been asked before, but I'm wondering how many times you've seen Paul McCartney live and what kind of cash you've laid out. I'd love to see him, but I'm not going to fork over $80 to get the one seat in the upper deck behind the foul pole. I've never seen Paul McCartney. I was hoping to see Wings on the Back to the Egg tour, which never happened. Okay, because he got busted for marijuana in Japan, and that was the end of the band. My father was willing to take me, because at 79 I was like 13 years old, but it never happened, obviously. And I've never gone to see Paul solo because tickets are astronomical. And yeah, $80, you're lucky you pay $80 for a seat like that. I bet you that seat probably cost $150. So yeah, I've never gone. From Michael Avery, I read a comment a few days ago that, although half-jokingly said, with the possibility of psychoactive substances becoming legal, might it bring a resurgence of interest in progressive rock, both old and new? After pondering the question, I think the point has merit. Looking at the music timeline, the psych rock trend of the 60s began to fade as prog took hold about 1970, bringing a refinement to the early experiments. My feeling is that prog is rooted in psych, so bringing psychedelics back into play might very well reboot prog for both listeners and musicians. Plausible or crazy, your thoughts? I don't know. I mean, that was a different time, Michael. But to put it into perspective, I think a lot of jam band fans, Deadhead fans, partake in, you know, marijuana and all the associated things, and that has always been the case. And could it be possible that with widespread acceptance, at least here in this country, with the legalization of marijuana, would people have interest in prog as well? Okay, because I mean, there's some similarities. That could be. I think, you know, back in the 70s, you know, as the 60s kind of finished out and the early 70s came about, you know, we moved from this era of psychedelics, you know, LSD and mescaline and hashish and marijuana and what have you, and you know, cocaine became very popular, especially in the music industry in the 70s. So the music kind of changed along with that. You know, obviously cocaine, you know, from what I understand, cocaine does different things to people than marijuana, obviously. So, you know, hard rock and metal all of a sudden became the popular things, you know, disco, all that kind of stuff, more fast-paced music, right? Livelier stuff, arguably. So all of a sudden a lot of the musical trends kind of followed the drug, almost like, right? You know, the 90s, you had, you know, grunge, and heroin became popular, and, you know, heroin's still a big problem to this day. So I don't know. Will prog, you know, I really don't know, to be honest with you. I think that there is a potential that a progressive music will make a comeback. Will it be based on, you know, marijuana being more popular because it's legal? I don't know. But like I said, there's a lot of similarities between like the jam scene and prog. Maybe we'll see kind of a meeting there. I have no way of knowing. From Gear Lad, I have a question for you, Pete. What is your opinion on the CD long box? I know someone that wishes they had bought more CD long boxes back when they were available. He thinks they are something special because they're no longer available. In my opinion, it's just extra cardboard. What are your thoughts on them, and do you have any in your collection? If so, what are they? I had a shitload of them, man. Back in the very early 90s when I was working in New York City, my buddy Steve and I used to go to a CD shop not far from where we worked that sold a ton of those long boxes. And we would buy them, I would save all of them, and I would hang them up on my wall. So when I was a single guy living in apartments and stuff like that, I had the CD long boxes lined up all over the place. You know, you had Chicago and Toto and, you know, Jethro Tull and whatever I was listening to at the time. You know, Queen, also, I'd had them all on the wall. But after a while, it just became ridiculous. Where am I going to keep these? You know where they all went? They all went in the recycling bin. But at the time, they were cool, but were they a waste of paper? Yeah, big time. Killing trees to make CD long boxes. You know, cool. I thought they were really cool, but I think it was probably a good thing that faded pretty quickly. But yeah, I had them all over my apartment. From Patrick Crowther, as we near the end here. Okay, Pete, I have a question for you. Do you think limitations in studio time and studio technology were a positive thing for musicians back in the day? In the early 70s, bands were spending a couple of months on an LP, and if that, and recording timeless masterpieces on 8 or 16-track consoles. If musicians are left to their own devices with no restrictions, they often go on long journeys up their own fundaments, like Prince with his quadruple albums to interminable funk jams. Yeah, I think there was a simplicity of recording albums back in the day that's kind of lost, or that got lost like late as the decade started to wither down into the 80s. I think, man, these bands who went and they wrote the tunes on the road, they perfected them on the road, then they went into a studio and recorded them, that's like the meat and potatoes right there. And that really worked. I think once you started, making more money, hiring these expensive producers, and all of a sudden you're spending 6 months, a year or more, you got all this, the record companies lavished all this money on you, all of a sudden, these records get a little more convoluted. So I think we need to get back to meat and potatoes, because there's nothing like those great raw albums from the late 60s and through most of the 70s, man. It's just something about them, Get in there, knock it out quick, right? Get out and get on the road. From Bong Along, now that you are in the midst of classic live album wars, are there any classic bands or soloists that did not release a live album that you wish they would have, or any that only released an unsatisfactory or bad audio, poor song selection recording? Well, the first one that comes to mind is Return to Forever, the great jazz fusion band. They released that Return to Forever live very late in their career in the 70s, after the classic band of Dimiola, Clark, Correa, and White kind of changed, and they brought back in the the woodwinds and the vocals, and I don't know, I very rarely listen to that live album. I would have loved to have heard a classic live album from that other lineup, the electric lineup. Also, we never had a classic live album from the Beatles. I mean, that's a band that just screams for a definitive live album from, like, 67 or something like that, or 67 or 68. I mean, they're like the one band from that era that's missing. You had great live albums from The Who and the Stones and, everyone else, and nothing from the Beatles, man. From Martin Dunn, no A-League rock metal band since '89. Changed my mind. All right, dude, you asked for it. Dream Theater, Symphony X, Soundgarden, Pantera, Alice in Chains, Rival Sons, Camelot, Spock's Beard, Anglerguard, Ekelin, The Flower Kings, Glasshammer, Seventh Wonder, Nightwish, Opeth, Death, Atheist, Morbid Angel. I could go on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Dude, we've had a lot of great A-list bands since '89. You just gotta listen to them. That's it. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on the mighty YouTube every damn day. So thanks for joining us. Put your comments in here below, and we'll use them on the next show. And we may do, in a couple of weeks, we may do a questions and answers live show. All right, so be on the lookout for that, where I'll just sit and take your questions live, and we'll see how that works. All right, guys? So have a good rest of the weekend. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Take care. Bye-bye.